Somebody cancels plans for the third weekend in a row, blaming a headache that sounds suspiciously convenient, and everyone around them quietly files it under flaky or antisocial or maybe just going through something. What almost nobody considers is the far more likely explanation, that nothing is wrong with that person at all, and the thing everyone reads as avoidance is actually a fairly sophisticated form of self-protection. If a Friday night in sweatpants sounds like a better reward than a Friday night out, stick around. Because the psychology behind that preference is nothing like what you have probably been told. Watch this whole thing, because the reframe that comes at the end changes how you will look at your own quiet weekends from now on. Start with the assumption everyone makes first, that staying home constantly must mean something is missing, some deficiency in energy, motivation, or social skill. Personality researchers working within what is now called the Big Five framework have spent decades measuring where people fall on the dimension of stimulation seeking, and one of the clearest findings across that research is that this trait is not a flaw sitting on a scale of better or worse, it is simply a stable, largely inherited setting, the same way height or dominant hand is a setting rather than a verdict. Some nervous systems genuinely light up in a crowded room. Others reach their peak functioning somewhere much quieter, and pushing past that point does not build character. It just produces a slower, heavier kind of exhaustion that outside observers rarely see, because it shows up hours later, alone, not in the room where the socializing happened. Two siblings raised in the exact same loud, busy household can grow up processing that same environment in completely different ways. One thriving on the noise, the other quietly counting the minutes until it is socially acceptable to leave. There is a second, less obvious piece of this preference, and it has nothing to do with introversion specifically. Predictability itself is doing a lot of the work. The neuroscientist Robert Sapolsky spent decades studying stress in primates and found something that applies just as directly to humans, that unpredictability is often more physiologically stressful than the actual difficulty of an event, meaning a mildly annoying but predictable evening at home can leave the body calmer than an enjoyable but chaotic night out ever will. At home you control the volume, the lighting, the timing of every single transition. Out in the world, none of that is guaranteed. Strangers talk too loud, plans shift without warning, small talk drags on with someone who was never actually listening to the answer. For a nervous system already running close to its limit, that unpredictability is not a minor inconvenience. It is the entire cost of admission. It is also why telling someone like this to simply relax and enjoy the party more usually lands about as well as telling someone afraid of heights to just stop being scared. The issue was never attitude. It was always the operating system underneath it. Send this to the person in your life who always seems to have a reason to stay in, because what comes next explains exactly what their calm is actually built on. Here is the detail that flips the whole narrative on its head. The psychologist Timothy Wilson ran a now well-known series of studies where participants were left alone in a room with nothing to do but think, and a striking number of them chose to give themselves a mild electric shock rather than sit with their own thoughts in silence for even a few minutes. Most people, it turns out, are not particularly good at being alone with their own mind. Which means the people who genuinely enjoy solitude are not avoiding anything. They are doing something most of the population finds close to unbearable, sitting quietly with themselves and actually finding that company sufficient. That is not a smaller version of a social life. It is a skill most people never develop, and it tends to produce exactly the kind of deep, undistracted thinking that a loud room can never accommodate. The best idea of the week rarely gets born at a crowded table. It shows up in a quiet kitchen at 11 at night, or in the 15 minutes after everyone else has gone to bed. None of this means every night spent at home comes from the same healthy place, and the distinction matters enough to name directly. Sometimes staying in comes from a genuinely different source. Social anxiety, an old wound, a depression that quietly asks what the point of leaving even is. For those situations, home stops being a place that restores you and starts operating more like a holding pattern, a comfortable enough cage that still keeps the world at a distance. The Harvard Study of Adult Development, one of the longest-running studies on human well-being ever conducted, found that the strength and quality of a person's close relationships was the single strongest predictor of a long, satisfying life, stronger than wealth, fame, or career success. That finding does not contradict anything we just covered, because loving solitude and having a small number of deep, well-maintained relationships were never opposites to begin with. The actual question worth asking yourself is simple. Does staying home fill you up, or does leaving simply feel too heavy to attempt? One of those is peace. The other is avoidance wearing peace as a disguise, and only you know, quietly, which one is actually running the show on any given week. For the people whose homebody tendencies come from the healthy version of this story, nothing about their life is smaller for it. It is simply built differently, arranged around small, specific rituals most people rush straight past. The exact chair by the window at the right hour of the afternoon, the same mug for the same coffee every single morning, the particular quality of light that shows up in the living room right before sunset. None of that requires an audience to count as a full life. The richness was always meant to be private. If you are someone who declines invitations without a flicker of guilt, who feels genuinely content on a solo Saturday with nowhere to be, who would rather rewatch the show that already feels like home than manufacture a new memory somewhere loud, none of that makes you broken or antisocial. It means your nervous system was simply built for depth over noise, and that was never something that needed defending in the first place. Tell us in the comments whether you recognized yourself in this or think we are just dressing up an excuse to stay in. Subscribe if you want the psychology nobody explains about their own habits, and leave a like before you go.